This is the Iron Sharpens Iron movement, sharing insights into the power of people-centric leading.
Hi, this is Jim, and today we welcome to our tribe an executive leader with over 25 years experience in recruiting and consulting with a focus in coaching and leadership development. Her work focuses on executive presence, including emotional intelligence, values-based leadership, boundaries and trust, feedback, and organizational awareness on assisting individuals and teams in creating the courage and vulnerability that you need to be a modern leader. This is Debbie Oberbillig. The Iron Sharpens Iron movement is brought to you by N2 Growth, a leader in executive search, leadership development, and talent management. We find and develop the world's best leaders. Learn more about our practice by visiting us at n2growth.com or click on the link in the show notes of this podcast. Well, hi, Debbie. Welcome to the Iron Sharpens Iron leadership movement. We are so excited to have you here today, and we're in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic that's really paralyzing the world right now. And you certainly have dealt with leaders in good times and bad. You've talked to so many people in your career, and I think it's going to be a great episode for our audience just to hear from you and your experience. So welcome to the tribe.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Debbie, I know you've been coaching for many years now, and you're located up in the Pacific Northwest. We read that on your bio, and I'd love to know what are some of your feelings on when, one of the biggest things that you've been quoted for is you help people work on how to show up every single day. So that's a really good quote in normal world, but now we've got the COVID crisis. Talk to me a little bit more about how to show up every single day, and what's your viewpoint on that?
Wow. When I say I help people show up every day, it's about how you treat people and who you are and who you're being. A friend of mine, I can't take credit for this, but a friend of mine says a job description includes what you need to do to be successful and also who you need to be. And so when I talk about showing up every day, that's really what I'm talking about. And then you mentioned the COVID crisis. To show up now, today, it takes courage. It takes vulnerability. I honestly feel that you show up every day the same way as you do in a crisis. I mean, if you're really working on being a good leader, you're going to work on showing up in a way that is most effective and helps people move forward.
Do you think in times of crisis like this that your true leadership traits actually come out even more? They're amplified even more?
Yes. And so I encourage, part of showing up is being self-aware, creating self-awareness around who you are, what triggers you, how you behave, and then self-management. Recognizing all of those things is great, but unless you manage those things, you're not effective as a leader. So what I mean by that is that this is a really scary time. People may feel very vulnerable as leaders, and yet they need to manage those feelings and recognize that courage is contagious, and that if they're leading from fear, their people will feel fear.
And so what happens, from a coaching perspective, I guess, what happens when somebody has low awareness? Because you sure can't manage it unless you're aware of it. So how do you help people internalize who they are, look themselves in the mirror and say, this is who I am? I find that many people have very low self-awareness.
That's true. And what's really, really a struggle for a coach, I think, is that self-awareness comes from internal self-awareness, working on yourself, seeking out information about yourself, learning how you react in the moment, observing your behavior. That's internal self-awareness. External self-awareness comes to us through feedback. And the challenge I see in business, in corporations today, is that we're all feedback averse. We do not want to give real actionable feedback. And so the very best feedback comes from, I mean, there's a variety of resources or sources to get feedback, but the very best feedback comes probably from 360s.
360 assessments is what you're referring to.
Yes. And, or from a really great boss who is willing to sit down with you and give you specific actionable feedback around your behavior.
But those kind of bosses are pretty rare themselves because a lot of times, even though you're the boss, you weren't brought up in the correct manner either. There seems to be a disproportionate amount of actually poor leadership, especially over the last 20 to 30 years, on how the people that are currently sitting in the seats today of leadership, they don't necessarily know what right looks like.
Yeah.
What's your opinion on that? Do you feel that same way too?
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why I love Brene Brown's work so much, Dare to Lead. And Dare to Lead was created, it's a business application of her books, Daring Greatly and Rising Strong. And in Dare to Lead, what it says is, we don't want to have those hard conversations at work because we don't want to be vulnerable. And if you think about it as a leader, and I know you've been a leader too, when you're managing teams and you're working with people, it's vulnerable to give them feedback because you don't know how they'll respond. Not everyone can hear feedback and accept it and respond to it and act on it. So that's a second complication around feedback. It's not just that leaders won't give it, it's that we don't take it very well or receive it very well.
So is the first step kind of coming back to self-awareness to be able to give it and take it and all those kind of things, this vulnerability? What are people living just in denial? Do they believe that there's a different perception? They perceive themselves as a different person than they actually are? And how do we start breaking through that? Kind of like they're guarded or they have a force field around them and they're like, they're just in a different reality than they actually walk through. What are some tools to help someone really realize who they are, become vulnerable, and embrace it, and then be able to come out of that and lead well?
Okay, so you asked me a few questions. One was, why don't people recognize why aren't they self-aware? And I'd like to share a story on that, and then I'd be glad to give some tools. Would that be okay? So when I was a young leader, pretty green, I hadn't been a leader for a long time. I was opening a new office for a company. It was an emerging consulting firm. And I was learning technology. I'd never done technology before. Plus, I was hiring and training a new team. And because I hired and trained effectively, I was invited to visit the company quarterly and train all new people coming into the company. It just was I was in the right place at the right time with great opportunities. However, my personality is a very driven, result-oriented person. I'm very competitive. I'm very results-oriented. And often what happens is that results-oriented people forget the people aspect of leadership.
Right.
And so what happened to me to accelerate that forward is that my team staged a coup. They wrote a manifesto that I was being controlling and did not let them grow, behave, run their own business. And this was after a couple of years. My team was the number one team in the company. I had taught them a lot, but I didn't let go once they knew. Once they started gaining confidence and success, I didn't step back a little bit, which I needed to do. And they did not like that. There were other things happening. There's always politics happening in business. A new office was going to be open. People wanted me to be either promoted out or to let go, basically. Right. So they wrote a letter to the CEO of the company, and she had me fly down to see her. And she did not let me read what they wrote, but she gave me their feedback. And believe me, that is not how you want to
Mm,
receive feedback. It was it was hard. It was hard. The bottom line was my team loved me because they were highly successful. They'd grown, they'd made a lot of money, they were doing really, really well, but I was too controlling and I wouldn't let go. Where was I in all of this? I had no
wow.
idea. I had no idea, no self awareness whatsoever. I thought I was driving the process, making them successful, helping them grow, continuing to help them make money. And so we had a disconnect. I was in total denial. And often in coaching, we call that a blind spot, right? I had a total blind spot. I was go, 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 achieve, achieve, achieve. We've got to be number one. And my focus was results and recognition for how great we were doing. And theirs was back off. We know how to do the job.
So Debbie, in that story right there, do you believe that a lot of people, I'm a big human centric leading kind of person. So you mentioned that your team was making a lot of money, hugely successful. Um, but do you believe that because you just drove them almost like a machine, right? Probably robotic in your actions on asking for things. At the end of the day, people still need to have that connection, that human connection out of you. Was that one of the biggest things that you just didn't have that sense of trust, and you certainly weren't vulnerable to them? What were some of the things that really your biggest lessons that you got out of it by the aha moment of, holy cow, I was not even aware that I was acting in this manner?
Well, oftentimes, and I notice that you have a background in personality assessments, and oftentimes people that are results oriented forget the people piece. So, you know what? I had a great relationship with them. We had a lot of fun. There were times when we were together. It wasn't that I was, just running over them. However, I didn't listen. I didn't, people want to feel heard and valued. They want to contribute. They want to have impact. I wasn't offering those things to them. They were ready to take on more than just being successful salespeople and making money. They wanted more than that. They wanted to be recognized as human beings, to your point. And so I forgot that aspect of it. And they let me know that. They wanted to be able to, like one of my people said to me, is adults don't tell other adults what to do.
Wow.
To the point of being so controlling. What happened in that story is that uh, I was so demanding, so driven that sometimes people were afraid of me. It was not that they felt that I would, they were just afraid that if they didn't do what I told them to do, I would get upset or that they would get in trouble or which, these are adults and yet they were really uncomfortable. It wasn't helpful for me to constantly be holding them accountable to the point of, why did you do that? What are you doing now? What are you spending your time on? It really was not productive. I learned a lot in that though.
What what was the success story out of it when you flew down, you had the big awakening? What was the airplane ride back home like? What was the self-reflection like?
The self reflection was that we really never know what other people think. And I don't mean that in a bad way necessarily. How I mean that is that we all have blind spots where we assume that we're doing the right things. I assumed that I was okay, that I was a great leader. And I think many of us assume that. And I see as a coach and people who I've seen it when I was working as a leader too. We can all see other people's struggles as leaders, and yet they're blind to them, right? So, what it did was it enlightened my blind spots for me, which was that I was too controlling and that I wasn't connecting with people on a human level.
So you mentioned earlier that you are a big believer in 360-degree assessments. uh, does this help? So if anybody in the audience isn't familiar, a 360-degree assessment is where you can have your peers, you can have your bosses, you can have your subordinates all talking about how is Debbie doing, what is she really like, and all those kind of things. And this helps potentially expose blind spots as long as they feel that they can talk openly about this and give a true assessment. But is this was this early moment in your leadership career one of the things that drove you to seeing the value of a 360? Because in essence it was a 360, right? Your subordinates were absolutely giving you feedback at this point.
It was. It would have, a 360s can be as extreme as mine was, where it was not a structured interview process or assessment where people fill out a form and give feedback, right? It wasn't a structured feedback. It was a call for help. And it still was 360 feedback, as you point out. And 360s are tough because many times, if someone's not prepared to hear it, or they're not coached around receiving the information, or, there's a lot of things that come into play with 360s. I've just started doing 360s in my coaching with some key people, and I do them from a point of view of developmental 360s, which is different than remedial. Oftentimes, people in the old days, coaching was to correct people, right? And problem people that were really, really, if they didn't get fixed, they'd be fired. Which I just don't think you can fix people,
Right.
right?
Agreed.
I think you have to help people come to awareness that some of the techniques that they use or how they communicate or how they show up, as I call it, are not effective to get the job done.
Yeah, absolutely. And you work a lot on executive presence also, right? How do you talk to us a little bit about what is executive presence and how important is that?
I think it's really important. As I was a young leader in this first when this team staged a coup. I was pretty junior, and I worked my way up in that company. Like I said, I was in the right place at the right time, and I worked myself up as an uh, executive vice president who in management that was on the board, and we were a public company. So I really worked my way up. And why I say that is you cannot work up within a company. At some point, you reach a level if you do not um, accept executive presence as a reality. And what I mean by executive presence, I define it as, most people define it as three areas, and I define it as character, substance, and style. And some people say style, they call it chutzpah, which is, I think style is a little bit easier. I'm a plain speaker.
Right.
So, what I mean by character is that's your integrity, how you treat people. Can people count on you? Are you trustworthy? All of those, who you are as a person is your character, and how you treat other people. Substance is what you offer within the organization, how you cooperate, the cross-functional relationships, the relationships that you built, your network. I think that's social awareness and relationship management, and which again is part of emotional intelligence, which I'm really big on. And then style is presentation. How do you look? How do you speak? It's not being a model, it's just how you're showing up as far as your whole package and how you communicate with people.
And would you say that from a leadership point of view, being a leader, that you have to have these? That like are these non-negotiable? Can you be like this leader that's super hip and just doesn't want to go down those stereotypical, things of having certain types of character or creating a style? Or at the end of the day, to be a leader comes with more responsibilities than just what's in between the two ears kind of thing.
Yes. Uh, in answer to your question, no, you can't just be the hip guy who doesn't, or gal, who doesn't include all three of those areas. In order to be an effective leader, you have to you have to encompass all three of those areas. I just think it's really important. People are, as a leader, you're modeling behavior, you're modeling presentation, you're representing the company. So that's style. That's what I mean by that, is how you're showing up and looking and representing the company, and modeling behavior for other people. Uh, as a character is your integrity, who you are, how you treat people. Those are the things that most of the time people work on in coaching. We all struggle working with human beings, and it's how we treat other people, really. And then substance is all about building those networks. And I defy any of us to really point to a successful person who does not have a strong network of individuals within their company that they work with, that they support, that they cooperate with. Otherwise, we build roadblocks without those relationships. So, from my perspective, you need all three of those areas to be a successful leader.
Yeah, I love that.
You need
One of the first awakenings I had growing up and becoming a leader, that first line supervisor leader kind of scenario, was in the military, and I was at this course that was talking about these newly promoted people that now we're going to supervise, and they said, you live in a glass house as a leader. Always remember that. People are always looking at you, whether you know it or not, and they're looking at you literally, physically. They're watching your actions. They see how you handle yourself, but they watch how you communicate, whether that's through email or talking on the phone or on a podcast or anything like that. You're always being watched in every way that imaginable. So you gotta, from a leader's point of view, imagine that you live in a glass house and you have to lead. You have to be that person that's more than just a subject matter expert.
I agree completely. And what I see happen is that leaders set the tone and other adults learn by observation. So if I lead in a way where I treat people poorly, or I have poor relationships with other departments, or I gossip about other departments, that creates the culture in which my group is living in, and they start emulating that behavior as well. And it creates a dysfunctional department, company, team. It's not effective leadership. And so, really being aware, I think you're absolutely right. And that was great advice. Being aware that you're in a glass house and setting the tone for everything around you is a huge concept for leadership.
So that goes beyond not only having how you started this off about your self awareness, but then you said also people need to self manage. And I guess this is part of that bucket of self management, is understanding what it's more than the job description when you become the leader.
Yeah. Self management is the hardest part. And that's where often a coach comes in, or a mentor is really. And so you asked me, what are the tools and how can people realize who they are and how do they correct those things? So the tools are, once you create self awareness, okay, I'm struggling, or my team is dysfunctional, or however you get those. If you're not getting a 360, or your company doesn't do that, or there's not a vehicle to offer that for you, then you seek out information as much as you can, recognizing it's not going to be complete. So if people hint at certain areas, I think you read between the lines. Another way to do so, you go to your boss and you say, I want to develop as a leader, and I'd like some direction or some goals and some areas to focus on. Are you willing to share some feedback with me? And then you might get some. So that's one way. Another way is personality assessments. There's a number of instruments available in the market, and You can start with those. I would recommend, some of the better known that are, rather than just, I like Gallup, but it's kind of basic and it may not give you as much insight as in depth as a full instrument. So I'd highly recommend, and you can ask your company if they use any specific personality assessments, because often they'll give you some feedback about what your weaknesses are, or your blind spots,
You bet.
and so those are some tools to start gathering. Or you can, the other thing that you can do is observe leaders in your company that you admire, respect, or that you've worked well with and that treat people well, and see how they act and how they behave.
Yeah, since we're both coaches, we're both big believers in these assessments, and it's really interesting when I give a senior executive a personality assessment. I I always ask them, because most senior executives have had multiple personality assessments in their career, different types, and I find that half the people love them and half the people just don't believe in them, and they're extremely dismissive to them because a lot of people are like, how can just a simple test all of a sudden determine who I am? But it's really interesting when you start to dive down and you really have the conversation with somebody and you get into the understandings of what this personality assessment is exposing. It's just really interesting to see the light come on. Most personalities are formed by about the age of 12. It's kind of embedded in your DNA at that point. But then you have this professional maturity, right? That starts to, you're aware of your type of personality, and then you're either auto correcting it, or you're overemphasizing certain traits and all of those things. And I just think it's extremely important that almost everyone have one so that they're aware and know what to do with it. An assessment's it's a gee whiz thing unless you do something up with it, right? And that do something with it could be just as simple as being aware of your personality traits and things like that. But they're extremely valuable. They're extremely valuable. And I think everyone, heck, they even do a lot of them free online now. They're very basic at that level, but it does start people thinking, wow, is that how I really do act? Or I never realized I was truly an introvert, but that explains why I freeze in front of people, things like that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And it's funny, being an executive that had challenges. Every single instrument that I've ever taken uh, says the same things, which is that I have that personality that's competitive and driven and results oriented. I also have the coaching personality, so I'm a mix of both. Which is, the thing for people to remember. So many things come up for me around these assessments. But one thing for people to remember is that your personality, it's a preference. It's how you prefer to lead, and you can adjust that
Correct.
to become more effective with other personality types. We all have preferences for how we are, and it's been simplified often into 4 personality types. But it's a really easy way for people to understand it. And if I'm a driver and I'm just really results oriented, oftentimes I can run right over people who are not that type of personality. It doesn't mean that they're not effective in what they do. It means that they have a preference for a different style. And I think it's recognizing uh, that we're all human beings with different styles, and working to relate on the level that's most effective with other people.
And I think also it's great for leadership teams and leaders of those teams to have these type of assessments so that you can avoid getting all the same personalities in a room together too, as your leadership team. You don't want all of the same type of person, because then you get into the group think, you get into huge blind spots and all of that. It's always best that a high performing organization is hyper aware of the diversity of personalities on their team, and they strive for that because it's that iron sharpens iron principle. You want someone to be a devil's advocate, you want critical thinking in the room, you want, if you're a hard driver, to have somebody that's very empathetic and really is a person, a people person, all of those kind of things. That's what drives high performing organizations at the end of the day.
I agree. And yet, when you coach senior level executives, and I know that I found this to be true in my career when I was a leader leading with that company. And when I coach now, you coach senior executives, and the diversity of thought is exactly what creates challenges. Because one person will look at the problem from this perspective. And when we get to be at the executive level, we often think that our way is the only way, right? We have a lot of conviction around our opinions. And so that's why it's so important as a leader to develop that ability to have curiosity and to be willing to listen to other people and to look at other perspectives. It's really important to recognize that. One thing you mentioned was you asked about tools, and something that I do with my coaching clients all the time. I think it's so simple, and yet it really does help. Is I recommend that they observe themselves in action, and it takes more than once, and you have to be really intentional about it. And I often tell people, mindfulness is overused, but this is really being mindful. And that is, okay, this morning, today, I'm going into a meeting with my team. What I want to do is I want to observe and listen and sit back and see who participates. I'll observe what they're doing and how they interact, but I want to observe how they respond to me. I want to observe what I'm thinking in my head while I'm communicating. It sounds complicated, but it's easier than it sounds. It's an intentional action where you say, I want to observe how I'm showing up.
I like that.
And
Intentional action.
yes, and you can't do it all day long. We could, the problem you mentioned, how do people operate day to day and they're not self-aware, and how does this happen? The problem is we're doing our jobs. We're driving process, we're holding people accountable, hopefully we're setting expectations, we're doing all those things we need to do, we're creating product or services and working with customers. There's so many things that our day is full of that we forget, and we're operating without intentionality. And so when we slow down and we say, okay, I want to be aware of what's going on in my head and what's happening around me, for a few minutes to observe how I'm showing up or how my actions affect other people, we get some really good feedback just by
Hmm.
observation.
So, Debbie, you know, if you wanted to be a better runner, you would go out and run more. If you wanted to be more intentional, what are some of the tools that a leader could use or that you could suggest to become more intentional? Is there some things that people can control or do or think about that makes them more aware like that?
Well, I think you seek out information that will educate you. So, separate from a coach, let's just say that I want to be a better leader and I don't have the opportunity to have a coach right now. Just as a better leader, I want to be a better leader at work. Well, then I start seeking out information about leadership, about leading people, about human behavior, and understanding how systems work. Just a real general background around how things work in business, and how I can be a more impactful leader, or how human beings are. There's so many elements, right? So, what I usually start people with is maybe the emotional intelligence 2.0. Uh, that book is really simple. There's an assessment. You can take it once, read the book about how to it. You don't have to read the whole book. You read the areas that apply to you. Then you can take it 6 months later to see if you've been working on it. It gives you some feedback without a lot of, without having to go out and pay a lot of
I
money.
am looking at my
Another thing,
bookshelf right now at Emotional Intelligence
yeah,
2.0. Everybody should have it on their
yeah,
bookshelf. You're exactly right with that one.
I agree.
That
It's a really
you
simple
bet.
tool. Another another tool, I'm a Dare to Lead facilitator. I do the work with organizations and individuals around daring and creating daring and courageous actions, which is really about vulnerability. So I think by reading a book like that, you might understand a little bit about what comes up for you, or what the challenges are, why you're not brave, or why you're not willing to be vulnerable. And just exploring books that communicate in a way, or podcasts like this one, that explore different areas of leadership, you can start saying, okay, I can see that I am not being vulnerable or authentic or transparent or whatever the word is with my team. And I want to work on that. So you set a goal, then you operate with some intentionality. And like I said, you can't be intentional all day long. I don't think people can do that. But you could say, I'm going to be intentional in this meeting today. I want to show up. I want to see how I show up, and if I get triggered by what people say, or what my emotions are through this process. And so then you go to a 1-hour meeting, and you attend the meeting with more intentionality, where I'm going to observe who I'm being right now, and then how I impact other people. And then you come back and you reflect on it, and you say, okay, I liked that I did that, but I did not like how I responded here. How can I change that? And you work on it. You set little goals, baby steps, and work towards creating change for yourself.
Oh, I love those. Those are great suggestions, Debbie. I couldn't agree more. And I'll add one more on there that I went through on my own personal journey. So I was exactly like how you were describing. When I love the art and science of leadership, so I could not get enough on articles and books and videos and everything about leadership. I would just eat it up. I could just read it all day long. Loved it. But what was interesting, and when you talk about being intentional, I, I read many books. I created my own form of leadership off of learning from others and reading and all those kind of things. But I was still missing something, and it really was being intentional. But the reason that I couldn't become hyper intentional is because I really couldn't necessarily hear the voice in my head. I couldn't hear myself thinking clearly. And years ago, I had someone introduce me to meditation. And it was really amazing to me from a leadership point of view that when I started to meditate, when I just had silence in the morning, right? When I was intentional about being silent for just a little bit, this isn't a half day event. This is just 10 minutes every morning, and being silent and meditating and all that. Could I start to finally hear my own voice? I couldn't hear my own voice because there was so much white noise about everything else. And meditation was one of the keys to unlocking intentionality for myself.
I absolutely agree. There's so much science that suggests that meditation impacts our well being, our leadership, who we are. It's so healthy to meditate. And whether you call it meditation or intentionality, it's just really reflecting a little bit, right? It's, and meditation is a little bit more, like you said, the silence, rather than thinking, having your mind operating and running. So I think I highly recommend that for leaders. The other thing that came up for me when you said that was how I started out, the difference between doing and being. So I think as a leader, we often think that leadership is doing, the job description. And so we get caught up in the how to's. We read the books about you said the art and science of leadership, but we read the how to lead a team, how to hold a meeting, how to be, how to. Life doesn't always have how to's when it comes to people. And who we're being. We have to decide who we are for ourselves. And we do that through a series of trial and error. And as human beings, we're always growing. They've shown now Again, science suggests that we learn into our 80s. It used to be the science of human beings used to be that people didn't learn after about, I don't know, I think they thought about 40 you quit learning, which is
Right.
ludicrous. So, from my perspective, you know, you have to reflect on your own behavior. What worked? What didn't? How did I show up? And what I mean by that is, how did people respond to me? Might be a better way to say, how did I show up?
Oh, I like that. Yep. Hey,
Because if you're effective, you're getting the results that you want, people are happy, you can tell. I think if we are intentional and we do observe other people, which is part of observation, there's the observation of self and observation of others in our interactions with them. If we do all of that, I think we can start creating more awareness and then start.
I love that. I love that. And you mentioned a lot, your dare to lead philosophy, and it's courage. It's courage. Can you talk? If I'm listening to this podcast right now, and we've kind of hit these strong points of self awareness and management, and the true difference between doing and being. Talk to me about tying this all together and having the courage to do this, and how are you truly defining courage through that dare to lead philosophy? And can you talk a little bit more about tying all of this in through courage and how important that is?
I'd be glad to. I do want to say that when we talk about courage and the things that I'm saying about courage, that comes directly from the work of Brene Brown, from the training that I've received as a facilitator of Dare to Lead, and the books that I've read about her work. Brene Brown is a researcher. It is scientific based information. She has interviewed over 40,000 people and collected their stories. She's a grounded theory researcher. So what that means is she collects stories and then she recognizes patterns in the stories. And what she's found is that it's not courage that gets in the way, or it's not fear that gets in the way of courage at work. It's armor. So what that concept is, Brene Brown is the master of metaphors. I love her work. And armor is a metaphor that she created to explain all of those behaviors and what we do, actions that we take to protect ourselves and to keep us from being vulnerable. Because oftentimes, most human beings see vulnerability as weakness and that we'll be hurt if we're vulnerable. And yet, vulnerability is required to connect with other people. So, as leaders, you see it often. Leaders don't want to admit that they don't know, or that they don't have all the answers, or they don't want to connect on a human level. They don't often listen. There's behaviors that we create to protect ourselves. So she calls that armor. And what's come up in her research is that it's not fear from people. It's not fear that keeps people from being courageous. It's the armor. And so courage is behavior that is observable, measurable, and teachable. And we can change that. But it starts with vulnerability. And I totally believe that because I had a great deal of armor. When we need to control, that's often a form of armor to protect ourselves from whatever the perceived threat is. Oftentimes we build behaviors when we're children from our experiences as kids. And so they don't serve us later, but we haven't changed those.
I'm reflecting on what you just said, and I'm like rewinding my life story in my head and thinking about those times where I've put the armor up. It is amazing. Like everybody, whether they realize it or not, is carrying that armor. And it's just a matter of how much you strip it down to become vulnerable, to really allow yourself to be truly you.
Yes. So Dare to Lead is about developing courage. It starts with the concept that it's teachable, observable, measurable, and then it teaches four skill sets. First is rumbling with vulnerability, and what again, rumbling is Brene's description of how you and I might connect. Let's say you're in ops and I'm in sales, and ops isn't getting the product out, and I need to come to you and be vulnerable and real with you rather than demanding and claiming my territory. I need to come to you and say, hey, we have a challenge. Can we solve this problem together? And what I'm telling myself when this isn't happening is that you don't care about the customer. In other words, I'm really communicating in a vulnerable way with you to try to connect so that you and I can solve the problem together. So it's a change in business because that's often not how people operate. We're too territorial about divisions. We get really caught up in our viewpoint and we don't listen to other people's viewpoints. And so being vulnerable requires that.
What's harder, being realizing yourself, trying to learn self-awareness, or opening up this vulnerability? And does it, because I guess, Debbie, again, we live in a world of coaching, and it is easy for us as coaches, even if we're not personally friendly with the person or have a professional relationship besides the coaching engagement that we're with that person. You bring up their vulnerabilities. You allow them to open themselves up to you. You have that sense of trust internally. But if you're a mid-level manager out there that maybe has a few friends that are neighbors and family and things like that, how is it the same thing as self-awareness, that just saying, I'm not vulnerable? How do I open myself up? Does it take these moments? Does it take the feedback? Does it take, I don't know. I'm putting myself in the mind of a listener right now and going, oh, it's really, yeah, I need to be more vulnerable. But that's a lot easier said than done.
Absolutely. In fact, oftentimes I have, I work a lot with one company, and I've been taking Dare to Lead through the company through different divisions and in specific groups and work and some cross-functional people. And it's funny, one guy will not even use the word vulnerability. He's just not comfortable talking about vulnerability. And yet others, well, first of all, I think it's really real. What I would say to listeners is we all deal with vulnerability every day. You can't love someone without being vulnerable. You can't be out driving in a car without being vulnerable. Vulnerability is risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. And we all experience that every day, all day long, in so many different ways. What Dare to Lead is about is recognizing that you're feeling vulnerable. It's going back to the self-awareness and saying and observing those vulnerable moments. So another part of Dare to Lead that Brene says that I just love and ties into this totally is self-awareness matters because who we are is how we lead. If we're not being vulnerable, then we're not leading with vulnerability and others can't be vulnerable. And think about it. How can you be brave and innovative and create new technologies or new ideas or new manners of processes or of sales without being vulnerable? It's scary to come up with something new. It's required.
I I will tell you, there's the aha moment in this podcast, in my opinion, is who we are is how we lead. That should be a wake up call for folks. This should be the energizing moment that everybody needs to realize that who we are is how we will lead. And for this discussion that we've had for the last 45 minutes, Debbie, it's been about this awareness and how do you manage it, and how do you become vulnerable. And if you just don't do those things, you will never achieve the higher levels of leadership that anybody could achieve because they're holding themselves back. And it's all because of
Yeah.
who they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I didn't start with that. It really is true. And
Yeah.
again, I can't take credit for that. That is a direct quote from Brene Brown in Dare to Lead. Self awareness matters. Who we are is how we lead.
Well, Debbie, I think that's a great spot for us to wrap up this episode of the podcast, because I want people to be fired up with that awareness that you just brought to us. That that the totality of leading comes down to those simple statements. And whether or not it comes from Brene or wherever, it's this conversation that you've brought to this audience about how important that is. And that's a pretty massive wake-up call, I think. So thank you.
I think thank you. Thank you. And I think, you just kind of put that together for me too, because I talk about how you show up, and that's exactly who you are is how you lead.
I love that's how we started it too, right? How do you show up every day? And the realities is how we're going to end the podcast today is who you are is how you lead. And that is showing up. And that is how you show up. So Debbie, again, thank you for spending this time with our tribe of listeners. This is a fascinating insight to how a coach's mind works, how a leader's mind works, and how you truly have helped us define a form of courage, and you helped us show the importance of self-awareness and self-management. And I thank you so much for today's episode. It was a great time talking with you.
It really was great talking to you too.
So again, Debbie, thanks again for this episode, and we hope to talk more with you.
I enjoyed it tremendously. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks for joining our leadership movement this week. Talking to Debbie about the difference between doing and being was a fantastic discussion about vulnerability as a leader today. Don't forget our show notes are posted on the website with key leader takeaways and suggested action plans. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast and tell a friend so that we can continue to build our tribe together. Join our Facebook group to get even more behind-the-scenes action and exclusive content for leaders. Until next time, remember that iron sharpens iron. Make yourself and others around you better every single day.